They say the most dangerous moments are the quiet ones. The ones where nothing seems wrong. The ones where a beautiful house sits still in the dark, lights off, gates closed, secrets sealed inside. But before we continue, please subscribe and turn on the notification bell for updates. So let me ask you something right now, before we go any further. What if the person who discovered the bodies wasn't shocked at all? What if they already knew what they were going to find? Because on a calm Sunday in Brentwood, inside a $13.5 million estate that most people only see from behind tinted windows and magazine spreads, Rob Reiner, 78, and his wife Michelle, 70, were found dead. Not peacefully, not quietly, but violently. Multiple sharp force injuries. Homicide. And almost immediately, the story locked onto a single explanation. A single suspect. A single narrative. The son who lived in the guest house. Nick Reiner, 32 years old, arrested that same night. Charged with 2 counts of first-degree murder. Case closed, right? Except it wasn't. Because almost as soon as police arrived, before the public even knew what had happened, something deeply unsettling entered the record. A warning. A name. A claim that would quietly shape everything that followed. Reports say the bodies were discovered by the Reiner's daughter, Romy, just 27 years old. And according to those same reports, she didn't just call for help. She allegedly told police something else. Something chilling. She warned them about a dangerous family member. Someone who, in her words, should be a suspect. Let that sink in. Not a stranger. Not a burglar. Not a random intruder. A family member. So here's the question no one seems comfortable asking out loud. Why was she already pointing the finger? And more importantly, at whom? Because while headlines rushed to Nick, another name barely surfaced at all. A name that, according to people close to the family, had already been erased long before blood ever hit the floor. Tracy Reiner. A woman who, insiders claim, had been kicked out of Rob Reiner's inner circle. Pushed aside. Cut off. Removed from the family orbit entirely. Not after the murders, but before them. And that's where this story stops being simple. That's where it starts getting uncomfortable. Because families don't exile people for no reason. Especially families with money, power, and a carefully curated public image. Especially families that understand how narratives work. So tonight, we're not just talking about what happened inside that Brentwood estate. We're talking about what may have been happening for years before it. We're talking about fractures, fear, control, and the kind of quiet manipulation that doesn't leave fingerprints. And yes, we're going to talk about Nick. But we're also going to talk about Romy and Tracy. And the things that don't quite line up when you slow this story down instead of rushing to a conclusion. Because here's the uncomfortable truth. Crimes like this are rarely about a single night. They're about long histories that finally collide. Now let's rewind. Rob Reiner wasn't just any Hollywood figure. He was legacy, influence, a name that opened doors and shaped careers. For decades, his image was stability, success, control. And Michelle stood beside him, part of that carefully maintained world. From the outside, the Reiner family looked like so many others at that level of wealth. Large properties, privacy, distance from the chaos of ordinary life. But inside those walls, according to multiple reports and sources, things were not as calm as they appeared. Nick lived in the guest house. That detail alone would later become a cornerstone of the prosecution's narrative. Proximity, access, opportunity. But proximity cuts both ways. Because proximity also means exposure. To arguments, to tensions, to things families don't want outsiders to see. And that's why the role of Romy Reiner becomes so important so early in this story. She's not just a witness. She's not just the daughter who made a horrifying discovery. She's the person who allegedly framed the danger before investigators had fully processed the scene. Ask yourself this. If you walked into a house and found your parents brutally murdered, what would you say first? Would you be able to speak at all? Would you even know what to think? Or would your mind already be racing through a list of people you believed were capable of something like this? Because according to reports, Romy didn't just express shock. She expressed fear. Directed fear. Fear toward a specific person within her own family. And that changes everything. Psychologists will tell you that in moments of extreme trauma, the brain either freezes or it reaches for patterns it already knows. That means whatever Romy allegedly told police didn't come from nowhere. It came from something pre-existing. A belief. A suspicion, a story that had already been forming. So where did that belief come from? This is where Tracy Reiner enters the picture and then disappears from it. According to insiders, Tracy was once close to the family, present, involved, part of the inner circle, and then suddenly, she wasn't. No dramatic public fallout. No headlines. Just quiet removal. Phone calls not returned. Invitations no longer extended. Access quietly revoked. In families like this, exile is rarely loud. It's surgical. And the most disturbing part? Some claim that Tracy's removal came after a revelation. A revelation tied directly to Romy. Something Romy allegedly uncovered or disclosed that changed how the family saw Tracy forever. What was that revelation? No official statements spell it out. No press releases explain it. But whispers persist. Whispers of manipulation, of influence, of a woman who, according to some, wasn't violent herself, but knew how to move people like pieces on a board. Now, let's be very clear. At this point, these are allegations, claims, questions raised by reports and insiders, not conclusions reached in court. But when you lay these pieces side by side, a disturbing pattern begins to form. A family fracture before the murders. A warning issued the moment the bodies were found. A suspect identified almost immediately. And another potential figure erased from the conversation altogether. And then there's the timeline. Officially, the date of death is listed as Sunday, December 14th. The cause, multiple sharp force injuries. The manner, homicide. But the date of death didn't come without controversy. Speculations swirled early on. Questions about when the attack actually occurred. About who last saw Rob and Michelle alive. About who had access to the property and when. Why does timing matter so much? Because timing controls narratives. If deaths occur earlier than believed, statements change meaning. Alibis shift. Discoveries look less accidental and more deliberate. And suddenly, the person who found the bodies becomes part of a much more complicated timeline. And that brings us back to Nick. Nick's arrest happened fast. Almost too fast, some would argue. The public was given a clear villain early. A son living on the property. A tragic but familiar story of family violence. But what if that narrative was convenient? What if focusing on Nick allowed everyone else to stop asking questions? This isn't about declaring innocence or guilt. That's for the courts. This is about recognizing how quickly a story can harden before all the facts are known. Because while Nick's life was being publicly dismantled, the deeper family dynamics were barely discussed. The exclusions, the warnings, the alleged revelation that reshaped relationships long before police tape ever went up. And here's something else that should bother you. If Romy truly believed a family member was dangerous, why? What had she seen? What had she been told? And who benefited from that belief? Influence doesn't require violence. Sometimes it just requires planting the right fear in the right mind at the right time. That's the theory some observers can't ignore. The idea that this wasn't just about who committed the act, but about who may have shaped the conditions that made it inevitable. A master planner doesn't need to hold the weapon. They just need to know where everyone will be standing when it falls. Again, these are questions, allegations, lines of inquiry that deserve attention, not conclusions etched in stone. But ignoring them would mean accepting a story that feels far too neat for something this brutal. Because real life is messy. Families are messy. And when power, money, and fear mix, the truth rarely comes out clean. So as we move forward, here's what I want you to keep in mind. Every chapter of this story connects to the next. Every warning echoes later. Every silence speaks. We're going to walk through this step by step. The night of the murders. Romy's alleged statements. Nick's arrest. Tracy's exile. The timeline discrepancies. The psychology of control. The possibility that the most important actions happened long before anyone died. And by the end, you may find yourself asking a very different question than the one the headlines want you to ask. Not just who did this, but who set it in motion. Because what came next, starting with the exact moment the bodies were discovered, would change everything. And no one saw it coming. They say tragedies don't announce themselves. They arrive quietly, with an almost sinister normalcy, and the world only notices when it's too late. That Sunday night in Brentwood was exactly like that. On the surface, the Reiner estate looked untouched, serene even. The kind of quiet you expect from a multi-million-dollar home tucked behind gates, guarded by cameras, and separated from the world by tall, manicured hedges. But inside, something had gone horribly, violently wrong. Imagine this, a sprawling estate, $13.5 million worth of Hollywood history and luxury. A home where every room told a story of legacy and love. The kind of place you might expect family gatherings, laughter, and carefully preserved memories. And yet, that night, the air inside those walls was thick with an unimaginable horror. Rob Reiner and Michelle Reiner had been stabbed to death. Multiple times. Sharp force injuries. Homicide. The words sound clinical on paper, but the reality? Unfathomable. The first shockwave hit with the discovery of the bodies. Reports say it was Romy Reiner, the 27-year-old daughter, who made the grim discovery. You can almost picture her walking through the quiet halls, expecting normalcy, only to be met with a scene no one should ever witness. The screams that weren't heard. The disbelief that must have gripped her. And then the moment when fear and reason collided. She allegedly warned police about a dangerous family member. Stop for a second. Think about that. In the chaos of discovering your parents' bodies, Romy allegedly points the finger at someone within the family. Not a stranger. Not an opportunistic intruder. Someone she presumably knew. Someone who lived within the orbit of their lives. This isn't just a murder story. It's a story about the hidden tensions, the quiet resentments, the fractures in families that outwardly appear perfect. It's about the way power, legacy, and fear can twist relationships into something unrecognizable. Police arrive quickly, as you'd expect for a scene like this. Flashing lights cut through the Brentwood night. Officers stepping carefully into a scene that was anything but ordinary. Forensic teams moved methodically, documenting evidence, taking photographs, cataloging every detail. But even with all this, the immediate focus was drawn to Nick Reiner, the 32-year-old son living in the guest house. Opportunity, access, motive, or at least the appearance of it. Nick was arrested that same night. 2 counts of first-degree murder. Headlines exploded. Son arrested in parents' murder. Hollywood family tragedy. Brentwood shock. Public perception was swift and brutal. And yet, this is where we begin to see the cracks in the story. Romy's warning about a dangerous family member, her statement, her fear, was barely mentioned in the initial coverage. It was an almost invisible thread in a tapestry dominated by Nick's arrest. But it's threads like these that often unravel the truth later. Let's pause for a moment. You might be thinking, of course, the son living on the property had to be the prime suspect. It seems obvious, but life is rarely that simple. And when you start looking beyond the immediate, when you start asking questions about timing, relationships, and history, the narrative shifts. Suddenly, the neat story headlines presented doesn't hold up under scrutiny. Consider the timeline. Official reports list the date of death as Sunday, December 14th. But early speculation raised questions. Was that really the day of the attack? Could it have been earlier? Why was there confusion? Every hour, every detail, matters in investigations like this. A shift of even a few hours changes alibis, moves suspicion, and reframes what witnesses are telling police. Then there's the question of proximity. Nick lived in the guest house, a detail that seems simple, even mundane. But proximity can cut both ways. Being close means opportunity, yes, but it also means exposure. Exposure to conversations, arguments, moments of tension that outsiders would never witness. Did this proximity make him a likely suspect? Or did it make him the convenient face for a narrative already being written behind closed doors? And what about Tracy Reiner? Once a close family member, she had been quietly pushed out long before these events. Insiders say this wasn't a momentary spat or a minor disagreement. It was a deliberate, surgical removal from family life. Invitations stopped, access revoked, contact minimized. And crucially, this removal allegedly followed a revelation by Romy that shook the family's perception of Tracy. It's impossible to overstate how significant this is. In families like the Reiners, public image is meticulously curated. Private conflicts are often hidden from view. But exclusion is never random. There's a reason, a trigger, and in this case, the trigger seems linked to Romy's warning. The same warning that suddenly made everyone reconsider who within the family was truly dangerous. Think about it. A daughter allegedly warning police about a dangerous family member, a son arrested within hours, and another key figure quietly removed from the story altogether. The scene is already complex, almost theatrical in its unfolding. And yet, there's still more beneath the surface. Because murder, especially within powerful families, is rarely about a single act. It's about history, grievances, power plays that have simmered unnoticed for years. The Reiner estate wasn't just a house, it was a stage. And that stage had been set long before the night of the attack. From a psychological perspective, Romy's reaction, if reports are accurate, is telling. When confronted with extreme trauma, humans respond in patterns. Either freeze, flee, or act. Her alleged identification of a dangerous family member might not have been a random impulse. It might have been based on prior knowledge, fear, and an understanding of how her family operated. And that's where we start asking the hard questions. Could someone manipulate family perception long before a tragedy strikes? Could fear be planted, influence wielded quietly, shaping what would later appear to be impulsive violence? These aren't accusations. They're questions raised by the sequence of events. And in cases like this, the questions often matter as much as the answers. Meanwhile, media coverage focused almost exclusively on Nick, the son, the guest house resident, the immediate suspect. And while the story was fast-moving, fast-selling, it left gaps. Important gaps. Questions about Romy's statements, about Tracy's exile, about what really happened in those hours before police arrived. Consider the contrast, a crime scene full of forensic evidence, and yet the narrative fixated on a single person almost immediately. Why? Convenience? Perception? Or something more calculated? And let's not forget the estate itself. Large, luxurious, meticulously maintained. Security systems. Multiple entry points. A property designed to safeguard privacy. Yet, despite these layers, tragedy struck inside. This underscores how, in families with influence and wealth, danger often comes not from outside forces, but from within. And now, here's the chilling part. If someone inside the family had knowledge, had influence, could manipulate the perception of others, then the crime itself is only part of the story. The real story is the network of relationships, resentments, and warnings that made it possible. This is the story we're diving into, piece by piece. The discovery of the bodies, the immediate responses, the warnings whispered in moments of chaos, and the history of relationships that shaped this violent night. Because if we stop at what's visible, the son arrested, the official reports, the headlines, we miss the undercurrents. The fractures, the whispered fears, the manipulations that may have occurred long before anyone picked up a knife. And it all starts with that night. That quiet, seemingly normal night in Brentwood. That moment when the Reiner estate transformed from a home into a crime scene. When ordinary life collided with extraordinary horror. But the story doesn't end at the front door. Not by a long shot. Because what came next, the investigation, the revelations, the family dynamics quietly unfolding behind closed doors, would change everything. And no one saw it coming. Imagine walking into a home you grew up in, only to find everything you knew about safety, love, and family shattered in an instant. That's exactly what Romy Reiner allegedly faced on December 14, 2025. At just 27 years old, she reportedly became the first person to discover the bodies of her parents, Rob and Michelle Reiner. But discovery alone wasn't what made her role in this tragedy so pivotal. It was what she allegedly said afterward. Almost immediately, Romy allegedly warned police about a dangerous family member. Think about that phrase. Dangerous. Family member. Those two words together carry more weight than most people realize. We instinctively trust family. We believe that kinship is a shield against harm. And yet, in her alleged statement, Romy effectively removed that shield. She suggested that someone inside her own family circle posed a threat. It's important to pause here and consider what this does to an investigation. Witness testimony is critical in any criminal case, and statements made immediately after trauma can carry enormous influence. Psychologists call this the primacy effect. The first information recorded often frames the rest of the narrative. In Romy's case, her words may have subtly directed law enforcement's focus, consciously or not, towards certain family members and away from others. The circumstances under which she made this statement are worth dissecting. Reports suggest she encountered law enforcement shortly after discovering the bodies. Imagine the intensity of that moment. The shock, the fear, the adrenaline. You've just seen your parents brutally murdered, and within moments, you're expected to provide clarity, guidance, and evidence. Most people would freeze. Most people wouldn't know what to say. And yet, Romy allegedly had the presence of mind, or perhaps the urgency, to identify a perceived threat. Now, we don't know exactly what she said verbatim, but according to reports, she hinted that a particular family member could be a suspect. She allegedly warned that this individual was dangerous. That simple warning shifts everything. In police investigations, the first person flagged can often shape the direction of the entire inquiry. Lead detectives, consciously or subconsciously, may start to focus attention on the individuals named or implied. But why would Romy speak so specifically in that moment? Was it intuition, fear, prior experience, or something else entirely? To answer that, we have to consider family psychology. Families, especially wealthy and influential ones like the Reiners, often operate on layers of communication that outsiders can barely perceive. There are unspoken hierarchies, hidden resentments, and subtle alliances. In such environments, knowledge isn't evenly distributed. Some members see patterns or threats others do not. Romy's alleged statement suggests that she had some prior understanding, some pre-existing belief about potential danger within the family. Trauma doesn't create that belief, it merely releases it. It also raises questions about timing and preparation. If Romy already considered someone dangerous before discovering her parents' bodies, that implies a history of concern, fear, or conflict. Was she acting on instinct, or on knowledge she had accumulated over years? What behaviors, incidents, or patterns might have led her to believe that a family member could inflict harm? And consider the complexity of loyalty. Family loyalty is one of the strongest social bonds humans experience. Allegedly pointing the finger at someone inside your own family after a traumatic event is not just emotionally taxing, it's socially and psychologically significant. It suggests that Romy felt an urgent need to communicate a perceived risk, even if it could alter relationships forever. From a law enforcement perspective, her statement would be a red flag. Detectives would have to balance the immediacy of the threat she described against the natural chaos of the scene. Was her identification accurate? Was it influenced by fear, stress, or misperception? Or was it grounded in real, actionable knowledge? This is where the narrative begins to complicate. While the public quickly focused on Nick Reiner as the primary suspect, Romy's warning about a dangerous family member adds a layer of ambiguity. The case is no longer a straightforward story of a son allegedly harming his parents. It becomes a web of interpersonal dynamics, prior warnings, and hidden histories. Psychologists studying trauma responses point out that memory under stress can be both heightened and distorted. In some cases, traumatic events trigger recollection of past patterns that might have been dismissed previously. Romy's alleged warning may have emerged from this kind of stress-triggered cognition, fear-sharpening perception, forcing the mind to connect dots that had been quietly accumulating over time. But here's the twist. Not all statements are treated equally in the media or in public perception. Headlines rarely delve into nuance. The press fixated on Nick's arrest, creating a simplified, linear story. Son lives in guest house, parents murdered, son arrested. The nuanced layers, Romy's alleged warning, Tracy's prior exclusion, family tensions, received minimal attention. Yet those layers are exactly what shaped the deeper story. Let's examine the consequences of Romy's alleged warning. If law enforcement takes her statement seriously, it influences investigative priorities. Certain individuals become persons of interest, others fade into the background. Resources are allocated accordingly. Interview strategies, surveillance, and evidence collection may all be subtly guided by a single line spoken under duress. And therein lies the complexity of the daughter's role. On one hand, she is a victim, a witness, a grieving child. On the other hand, her statement may have served as an unintentional pivot point in the case. It's not uncommon for trauma witnesses to shape investigations in profound ways, even without intending to. So let's ask the hard question. Could someone have anticipated her reaction? Could a family member have influenced her perception beforehand? planting seeds of fear or suspicion that would crystallize at the moment of discovery. In cases involving family intrigue, the answer is often yes. Influence, manipulation, and prior tension can prime individuals to interpret events in a particular way, even unconsciously. The implications are staggering. The first words at a crime scene can reverberate throughout an investigation, coloring every decision made thereafter. And Romy's alleged warning, specific, pointed, alarming, set the tone for how law enforcement approached the Reiner household. But even more haunting is what this suggests about family dynamics before the tragedy. For a 27-year-old to label someone dangerous, there must have been history. There must have been observations, patterns, or experiences that led her to that conclusion. And in the context of the Reiners' wealth, power, and privacy, such warning signals are rarely trivial. Meanwhile, the media and the public continued to focus on Nick. The arrest, the charges, the image of a son living in the guest house became the simplified story. But real life, especially when wealth, secrecy, and complex family dynamics are involved, is rarely simple. Romy's statement hints at layers hidden beneath the surface, layers that may hold crucial context for understanding the tragedy. And it doesn't end there. The ripple effect of her warning arguably reaches further than investigators, shaping perceptions within the family itself. If a daughter expresses fear of a family member, it can shift alliances, sow doubt, and alter interactions in subtle but profound ways. Long-standing relationships can fracture under the weight of suspicion, even before law enforcement completes its work. Think about the emotional impact on the family. Romy's words, spoken in a moment of trauma, might have been a cry for protection, a desperate attempt to prevent further harm. But they also could have been perceived as an accusation, a signal that someone close could not be trusted. The fallout from such statements doesn't stay in the police report. It echoes through the family, altering trust, loyalty, and fear. In that sense, Romy's alleged warning becomes a pivotal point not just in the investigation, but in the broader narrative of family dynamics. It introduces ambiguity, reshapes suspicion, and sets the stage for questions that remain unresolved. And here's the cliffhanger we can't ignore. While Romy's words drew attention, one family member had already been quietly removed from the narrative. Exiled, silenced, excluded, Tracy Reiner. Her absence raises more questions than answers. Was she truly unrelated to the events? Or was her prior removal connected, in some way, to the warnings, fears, and hidden tensions that exploded into tragedy? Because in families like the Reiners, the story isn't just about what happens in a single night. It's about a chain of events, decisions, and dynamics that can build quietly over years, until one day, everything collapses in a single, violent instant. By the time the police finished their initial walkthrough of the Reiner estate, the public narrative had already begun to solidify. Almost immediately, all attention shifted to Nick Reiner, the 32-year-old son living in the guest house on the property. To the world, he was the obvious suspect. Opportunity, proximity, motive, or at least the appearance of it, made him the prime figure in a story that already had too many questions and too few answers. But as anyone who studies criminal investigations knows, the obvious suspect is not always the full story. Let's start with the basics. Nick lived in the guest house, a separate structure on the estate, close enough to have access to the main house, far enough to have independence. For law enforcement, that proximity is critical. In the early hours of an investigation, police look for who had access, who was present, and who could plausibly commit the crime without arousing suspicion. Living on the property ticks all of those boxes. The arrest came quickly. Nick was charged with 2 counts of first-degree murder. The timing of that arrest is notable. It happened the same night the bodies were discovered. The speed suggests law enforcement felt they had probable cause, or at least compelling initial evidence. But here's the nuance. Rapid arrests can sometimes oversimplify a complex situation. In high-profile cases, there's immense pressure to act decisively. The public demands answers. Headlines demand clarity. And yet, in the urgency to secure a suspect, the investigation can overlook context, motive, and alternative explanations. Public perception immediately turned against Nick. Social media erupted with speculation. News outlets published headlines framing him as the son who allegedly killed his parents. The narrative was neat, linear, and emotionally compelling. A wealthy family, a son in the guest house, parents found dead, crime solved. But life rarely conforms to simple stories, especially when family dynamics, hidden resentments, and psychological factors are involved. Let's examine the alleged evidence that placed Nick in the spotlight. First, the guest house. Being on the property allowed him proximity to the crime scene. He knew the layout. He had access. In a murder investigation, access is everything. Second, the timeline. If authorities determined, or at least believed, that the deaths occurred on December 14th, Nick's presence on the estate aligns with the critical window. Third, circumstantial observations. Reports from neighbors or staff, if any existed, may have suggested unusual activity, though specifics have not been publicly disclosed. But while these factors seem damning at first glance, there are layers that complicate the picture. Nick's proximity doesn't confirm motive. Presence doesn't confirm intent. Access doesn't prove action. And yet, once a narrative is set, especially in the public eye, it can be nearly impossible to step outside of it. Consider the role of family dynamics. Nick was not just a son living on the property. He was part of a larger network of relationships fraught with tension, exclusion, and history. Romy had allegedly warned police about a dangerous family member. Tracy had been quietly removed from the family circle. These relational factors, while not part of the initial public narrative, create a broader context in which Nick's arrest is only one piece of the puzzle. Then there's the psychological dimension. Investigators often rely on behavioral analysis to understand potential suspects. Nick's living situation may have placed him under scrutiny, but psychological experts caution against assuming guilt based solely on proximity. Personality, past behavior, and family relationships all factor into a nuanced understanding of what may have occurred. Another critical element is media framing. In cases like this, speed of reporting can create a presumption of guilt. Headlines frame the story, social media amplifies it, and public opinion forms before the investigation fully unfolds. This can have profound consequences, not just for the accused, but for the perception of the family, the investigation, and the broader narrative. But let's step back and ask the bigger question. Why did Nick's arrest happen so quickly? Was it simply the evidence at hand, or was it influenced by prior family dynamics, reports, and warnings? Romy's alleged statement about a dangerous family member, for instance, could have subtly directed investigative focus. Even if unintentional, her words may have influenced how authorities interpreted opportunity, behavior, and motive. And this is where the complexity deepens. If one person in the family is flagged as dangerous, the rest are suddenly seen through that lens. Suspicion can be contagious, perception can be manipulated, and decisions that appear purely procedural may be subtly guided by internal knowledge. At the same time, Nick's arrest raises questions about narrative convenience. He was the son in the guest house. He was present on the property. He fit the image of a suspect that the media and public could easily grasp. But what about the other individuals who were excluded from the narrative entirely? Tracy Reiner, for instance, had already been pushed out of the family circle. Her absence from the story is notable. Was her prior exclusion connected to long-standing family tensions? Could it have shaped how suspicion was allocated once the crime occurred? We also need to examine the broader context of wealth and privacy. In families like the Reiners, conflicts are often hidden from view. Estate managers, staff, and extended networks can act as buffers that conceal underlying tensions. Access, therefore, is not just physical, it's relational. Nick's position in the guest house might have made him visible, but it also could have made him a convenient scapegoat in a scenario where complex family dynamics went unnoticed. Moreover, the timing of the deaths adds a layer of ambiguity. If the murders occurred at the officially reported time, Nick's presence seems suspicious. But if the timeline is off, even by a few hours, it could change interpretations of opportunity and motive entirely. Early speculation suggested that the exact moment of death was unclear. Investigators rely on forensic evidence, witness statements, and scene analysis to determine timing, but initial reports can be misleading, especially when adrenaline, shock, and trauma influence recollection. Consider, too, the human element. Nick is, at the core, a son, a family member, a human being caught in an extraordinary and horrifying situation. Being accused of murdering your parents is unimaginable. The psychological pressure, media scrutiny, and legal consequences are immense. And yet, the rapid framing of him as the immediate suspect illustrates a pattern we see often in high-profile cases. The need for clarity, for a face to blame, can sometimes outweigh the complexity of the truth. And let's not overlook the potential strategic influence of family dynamics. If Romy's alleged warning and Tracy's prior removal shaped how suspicion was directed, it underscores the subtle, sometimes invisible ways influence operates within families. Fear, perception, and prior conflicts can prime investigators, consciously or unconsciously, to focus on certain individuals while others remain in the shadows. All of this culminates in a central tension. Nick may be the face of the arrest, the subject of headlines, and the focal point of public attention, but the story is far from complete. The interactions, the history, the psychological factors, and the hidden dynamics all suggest a deeper, more intricate narrative. Which brings us to the inevitable question: was Nick truly the orchestrator of this tragedy, or was he, in many ways, the convenient center of a story already shaped by prior family tensions, warnings, and exclusions? Because in a family like the Reiners, appearances can be deceiving. Proximity can mislead. Public perception can distort. And the truth, complicated, layered, and uncomfortable, often lies in the shadows between what is reported and what is whispered behind closed doors. And that shadow is where Tracy Reiner quietly waits. The family member who had been removed, excluded, and almost erased from the narrative before the murders ever occurred. Her absence, and the reasons behind it, will become increasingly significant as we move deeper into this story. Because while Nick is the face of suspicion, the undercurrents of influence, secrecy, and long-standing family fractures may reveal a story far more complex than the headlines suggest. In every family, there are stories that are never told, secrets that fester quietly in the corners of memory, tensions that are never resolved, only buried beneath layers of politeness, tradition, or wealth. In the Reiner family, Tracy Reiner occupies one of those corners, a figure quietly removed, quietly erased, and largely absent from the public narrative surrounding the December 14th murders. But her story is crucial to understanding the complexity of what unfolded that night. Tracy was once a central figure in the Reiner household, close to her father, Rob, and involved in the family's affairs in a way that suggested influence and trust. Yet, according to insiders, at some point she was pushed out. The details of this removal are murky, but the impact was clear. Invitations ceased, access was revoked, and her presence in the family's inner circle dwindled to almost nothing. She was, in effect, exiled. Exile in wealthy families is rarely dramatic. It doesn't typically involve shouting matches or public confrontations. It's quiet, surgical, strategic. Calls are ignored, interactions become sparse, and slowly, almost imperceptibly, the excluded individual is erased from the day-to-day narrative. It's a subtle form of control, and in many ways, it can be more powerful than confrontation because it rewires the social map without raising alarms. What makes Tracy's exile especially noteworthy is its timing relative to the alleged revelation made by Romy. Reports suggest that Tracy's removal came after Romy disclosed something that unsettled the family, a disturbing insight, a warning, or knowledge that redefined how they saw her. The specifics remain unclear, but the correlation raises uncomfortable questions. Did Romy's warning set the stage for Tracy's exclusion? Did it frame her as a figure to be cautious of, perhaps even feared? The psychological and social impact of this kind of removal cannot be overstated. Being cut off from a family, especially a powerful one, is both emotionally and socially devastating. It isolates the individual from relationships, decision-making, and access to information. In the context of a wealthy, influential family like the Reiners, it also often removes the individual from financial, professional, and legacy considerations. Exclusion here is not merely a social snub. It is a form of structural disempowerment. From a narrative perspective, Tracy's absence is critical. While the public fixated on Nick as the primary suspect, Tracy's removal meant that one potential angle, the history of family tension and conflict, was largely invisible. She became a footnote in the story, even though her presence, or lack thereof, may hold clues to understanding long-standing dynamics. Consider the possible reasons for such a removal. In families with wealth and influence, decisions about inclusion and exclusion are rarely arbitrary. They often stem from perceived threats, breaches of trust, or the need to control narratives. If Tracy had knowledge, influence, or behavior that challenged the family's cohesion, or threatened to expose uncomfortable truths, removal would be a logical, if harsh, strategy. And here's where it gets more complicated. Some reports and insiders suggest that Tracy's exile may have been tied to behavior or knowledge that was not violent in itself, but influential in a subtle, manipulative way. In other words, she may not have wielded a knife or raised a hand, but her understanding of the family, her ability to move people, and her awareness of secrets could have made her a figure of concern, especially in a household where control, perception, and reputation are paramount. The irony of her removal is striking. In isolating her, the family may have unintentionally increased her symbolic power. Absence, after all, is a powerful statement. It creates curiosity, suspicion, and gaps in the narrative. For investigators, journalists, and even the family itself, an absent figure becomes a point of speculation, a question mark in an otherwise controlled story. Tracy's situation also highlights the fragility of family alliances. Even in households with wealth and influence, relationships are built on perception as much as reality. Trust can erode quietly. Allegiances can shift without notice. And those who are perceived as threats, whether or not they actually pose a danger, can find themselves on the outside, excluded from decision-making, communication, and protection. Another dimension to consider is the emotional toll of exclusion. Being cut off from the family you grew up in is profoundly destabilizing. It creates resentment, isolation, and in some cases, paranoia. While there is no public evidence that Tracy was involved in violent behavior, exclusion can intensify emotions, creating a psychological environment that is volatile and unpredictable. In other words, removing someone from a powerful family doesn't erase their influence. It sometimes magnifies it in indirect ways. It's also worth noting the social optics. In the public eye, Tracy's absence was barely noticed. Headlines focused on Nick, the son in the guest house, and on Romy, the daughter who allegedly warned police. The media rarely addressed the layers of pre-existing tension, the quiet removal of a once central figure, or the implications of such exclusion on family dynamics. Yet for those who study family psychology and criminal investigations, these details are significant. They hint at unresolved conflicts, potential motivations, and psychological pressures that might otherwise be invisible. Now, let's ask the question that few dare to voice. If Tracy had already been removed from the family before the murders, what role does her absence play in the unfolding events? Exclusion does more than isolate. It reshapes the social landscape. It can create vacuums of power, redirect suspicion, and alter interactions in ways that are subtle but consequential. For investigators, the absence of someone like Tracy might obscure the full picture of relationships, influence, and potential motives. This is particularly relevant when considering Romy's alleged warning. If Tracy's removal followed a revelation that Romy made, it suggests that Romy's perception, and potentially her influence, played a critical role in shaping who was considered dangerous. In families like the Reiners, the intersection of perception, influence, and control is where narratives are made or broken. The layers here are essential. Nick becomes the immediate suspect, Romy acts as the warning voice, and Tracy exists in the shadows, absent from the narrative but potentially central to the underlying dynamics. Her exile underscores a critical point. What is not said, who is removed, and who remains silent can be as impactful as the actions that occur in plain view. And here is the chilling pivot. While Tracy's absence seemed to remove her from immediate suspicion, the very circumstances of her exile, combined with Romy's warning, plant questions about the pre-existing conditions that made the night of December 14th possible. History, relationships, warnings, and exclusions all collide. Murder does not happen in a vacuum. It occurs in a context built over months, years, and decades. The takeaway here is clear. To understand what happened that night, we cannot focus solely on what was visible. We must consider what was hidden, what was whispered, what was intentionally erased. Tracy Reiner's removal is one of those hidden layers, quietly shaping the narrative even before the bodies were discovered, and quietly influencing perceptions that may have guided investigators, media coverage, and even family reactions. And as we prepare to delve into Romy's alleged revelation in the next chapter, remember this. Sometimes, the most important players in a story are not the ones immediately visible. Sometimes, they are the ones whose absence or exclusion shifts the trajectory of events in ways no one sees coming. In the months and weeks leading up to December 14th, the Reiner family was, on the surface, like any other high-profile household. Public appearances, private dinners, and the careful maintenance of a cultivated image. But behind closed doors, according to reports, tensions simmered, tensions that would erupt into tragedy. Central to this hidden dynamic is a claim allegedly made by Romy Reiner, the 27-year-old daughter whose discovery of her parents' bodies became a pivotal moment in the investigation. Romy's warning to police about a dangerous family member did more than signal immediate concern. It opened a line of inquiry that shifted attention, altered priorities, and, most importantly, introduced a psychological framework through which investigators, and perhaps even family members, interpreted subsequent events. The question we have to ask is this: what could have led a daughter to label a relative as dangerous in the moments immediately following a horrific discovery? Insiders suggest that Romy's revelation was not a spur-of-the-moment statement, but the culmination of observations and experiences accumulated over time. Families, especially wealthy and influential ones, have intricate networks of alliances, loyalties, and subtle power dynamics. The patterns she noticed, the behavior she observed, and the history she witnessed likely contributed to her perception of threat. Consider the timing. If Romy had indeed been cultivating concern over a specific family member for years, watching interactions, noting tensions, or witnessing manipulation, then the moment she encountered the scene on December 14th became a trigger. Trauma does strange things to memory and cognition. In highly charged moments, the mind often reaches for patterns it has long stored, attempting to impose order on chaos. In Romy's case, that order manifested as a warning, a signal to law enforcement that danger was present within the family circle. But the content of that warning is what makes it extraordinary. To allege that someone within your family is dangerous is to break one of the most fundamental social rules of kinship. Families are, by definition, supposed to be safe spaces. They are supposed to be protective, nurturing, and loyal. To identify danger within that sphere is to upend the most basic assumptions about familial trust. Psychologically, this is fascinating. Trauma research tells us that people under extreme stress often operate under heightened vigilance. Threats are perceived more acutely, and prior knowledge or suspicion can crystallize into urgent warnings. Romy's alleged statement may have been a manifestation of this process. Fear sharpening perception, experience guiding judgment, intuition forcing articulation. But we cannot ignore the social implications. In high-profile families like the Reiners, perception is reality. Warnings, accusations, or suspicions carry immense weight, particularly when voiced in moments of heightened credibility, such as immediately after a crime is discovered. Romy's words had the potential to shape not only the investigative focus, but also internal family dynamics, influence public perception, and reorient allegiances. Now let's explore the content of the revelation itself. According to reports, Romy allegedly indicated that a family member, someone who had been quietly removed or sidelined, posed a real threat. While names are not officially confirmed, sources point toward Tracy Reiner, a figure who had been exiled from the inner circle. This connection is critical. Tracy was not just absent from the narrative. She had been systematically excluded prior to the murders. If Romy's warning highlighted her as potentially dangerous, it implies a pre-existing belief or concern that informed her perception in that crucial moment. This raises an uncomfortable question. Could Romy's warning have been influenced, consciously or unconsciously, by prior family dynamics? In households with power, wealth, and influence, subtle manipulations are common. Alliances shift, perceptions are shaped, and fears can be planted or amplified over time. Romy's statement may not have been made in a vacuum. It may have been the product of years of observation, influence, and the internal politics of a family that was far more complex than the public ever understood. And here's the critical twist. By making this revelation at the moment of trauma, Romy effectively changed the trajectory of the investigation. Law enforcement now had a narrative thread to follow, someone deemed dangerous, someone whose behavior and presence required scrutiny. At the same time, the public's understanding of the case was already being shaped by Nick's immediate arrest. The juxtaposition of the son as the prime suspect and the daughter's warning about another family member creates an uneasy tension in the story. The narrative is linear in public perception but multi-layered in reality. From a legal and investigative standpoint, Romy's warning is a delicate piece of evidence. Witness statements made under duress are powerful but also potentially unreliable. Trauma can distort memory, heighten perception, and magnify fear. Investigators must weigh the content of the warning against corroborating evidence, timeline analysis, and behavioral observation. Yet, even if her warning is taken as partially credible, it introduces a second potential suspect, or at least complicates the monolithic focus on Nick. Consider, too, the implications for family dynamics. A warning like this does not merely direct law enforcement. It can fracture familial relationships. Trust is undermined. Fear is amplified. Allegiances shift, and the social map of the family is rewritten in real time. Romy's revelation, therefore, is not just a comment to police. It is a catalyst for internal upheaval, a spark that illuminates the hidden fissures in the Reiner household. And then there is the issue of credibility. In the days following the murders, Romy became a figure of immense interest. Journalists, investigators, and even family members may have scrutinized her every action, her past interactions, and her perceived reliability. Being a witness is a double-edged sword. One moment, you are the key to understanding the crime. The next, you are subject to intense scrutiny, your motives questioned, and your character analyzed. But Romy's alleged revelation also had an indirect effect. It cast a shadow over Tracy Reiner, who was already absent from the family narrative. Absence can amplify suspicion. When combined with a warning from a credible witness, it turns the missing figure into a focal point of curiosity and potential implication. The exclusion that may have seemed like a private family matter suddenly takes on public significance, raising questions about motives, history, and possible influence. It's important to note that all of this occurs before the legal process begins in earnest. Charges against Nick are filed, headlines dominate public discourse, and the investigation progresses. Yet beneath the surface, Romy's alleged revelation lingers as a critical, unresolved thread. It challenges the simplicity of the initial narrative, introduces ambiguity, and underscores the complexity of familial relationships under extreme stress. And here is the cliffhanger we cannot ignore. The warning suggests that someone, quietly removed from the family, may have had the ability, knowledge, or influence to shape events leading up to the murders. Was this influence direct or indirect? Was it intentional or circumstantial? And could understanding this connection alter the story we believe we know? As we move forward, we must examine the interplay between Romy's revelation, Tracy's exile, and Nick's immediate suspicion. The murder itself is only one part of the story. The hidden dynamics, subtle influences, and pre-existing tensions are equally crucial. Because in families like the Reiners, the most dangerous forces are often not the obvious ones. They are the quiet, calculated, and sometimes invisible patterns of influence that set the stage long before a single violent act occurs. The Reiner estate, with its sprawling lawns, towering hedges, and $13.5 million price tag, was the epitome of Hollywood elegance. To the casual observer, it was a place of beauty, history, and meticulous care. But on December 14, 2025, it became a scene of unimaginable horror. Inside those walls, Rob Reiner, 78, and Michelle, 70, lay dead from multiple sharp force injuries. The manner of death was ruled homicide, and the estate transformed overnight from a sanctuary into a crime scene. Visualize it. The front gates closed, security cameras blinking silently in the darkness, the estate bathed in the cool glow of streetlights. Police vehicles arrived, lights flashing, officers stepping carefully across manicured lawns. Forensic teams quickly moved inside, documenting every corner, photographing every detail, and cataloging the evidence that would become critical to the investigation. Every inch of the property was scrutinized. Every doorway, hallway, and staircase became part of a puzzle that investigators were desperate to solve. The guest house, where Nick Reiner lived, became a focal point almost immediately. Proximity to the main house made him the logical first suspect in the eyes of law enforcement. But beyond the simplicity of location, the crime scene itself told a story. Multiple sharp force injuries indicated violence, rage, and a personal nature to the attack. This was not a burglary gone wrong. This was a deliberate, intimate act, and the scene carried psychological weight. It spoke to chaos, fear, and desperation. For Romy, discovering the scene must have been incomprehensible. The daughter who found her parents in such a state had to process shock, grief, and fear all at once. It is in this chaos that she allegedly made her warning about a dangerous family member, a moment that would shape the trajectory of the investigation. Witness statements in such circumstances are critical, but they are also complicated by trauma, stress, and heightened emotions. Her identification of a potential threat within the family would not be a minor detail. It became a defining piece of the narrative. The forensic process itself was meticulous. Investigators photographed every surface, collected fingerprints, documented blood spatter patterns, and preserved evidence for later analysis. Every knife mark, every trace of DNA, every anomaly was recorded. Forensic science is painstaking, precise, and slow, but in a case like this, it is the backbone of establishing what happened, how it happened, and, critically, when it happened. And timing was a crucial question. Official reports list December 14th as the date of death, but early speculation suggested uncertainty. Could the murders have occurred earlier? How does the timeline align with Nick's presence in the guest house? With Romy's discovery? With the patterns of family activity that day? Even a few hours' discrepancy could change interpretations of opportunity, motive, and suspicion. Beyond the technical details, the crime scene revealed the emotional and psychological dimensions of the tragedy. This was a family home, filled with memories, possessions, and personal history. Blood on the floors, disrupted furniture, and the physical evidence of violence clashed violently with the expectation of safety and normalcy. It created a psychological shockwave that rippled through everyone connected to the family. Investigators also faced a complex social environment. Staff, neighbors, and friends were interviewed to establish timelines, verify alibis, and uncover potential motives. Every interaction, every recollection, became a piece of the puzzle. In high-profile families, information is both abundant and difficult to parse. Loyalty, discretion, and fear can all influence testimony. People see patterns differently, and subtle manipulations or omissions can distort the full picture. And this is where family dynamics intersected directly with the investigation. Romy's alleged warning about a dangerous family member added a layer of internal suspicion. The focus was no longer solely on physical evidence. It extended into relationships, histories, and psychological insight. The crime scene was not just a place of violence. It became a map of influence, fear, and pre-existing tensions. Meanwhile, Tracy Reiner's absence loomed in the background. The family member who had been removed from the inner circle was, in a sense, erased from the physical and narrative space of the estate. Yet, the potential implications of her prior exclusion could not be ignored. Investigators, consciously or unconsciously, had to consider the social map of the family: who was present, who was absent, and how prior tensions might have shaped events. The crime scene also presented contradictions. The level of violence suggested personal animosity, but the narrative of a son living in the guest house, suddenly accused, simplified a far more complex picture. Access, proximity, opportunity, these factors were evident, but motive, history, and influence were murky. The forensic evidence alone could not tell the story of relationships, whispered fears, or the psychological undercurrents that shaped the family. Security systems were another point of interest. Cameras, locks, alarms, designed to protect the family, became part of the investigation. Who entered? Who left? When? How were the gates and doors secured? In estates like this, technology adds layers of both protection and scrutiny, but it also raises questions. If access was controlled, how did the crime occur? And what does that suggest about the perpetrator's familiarity with the property? The crime scene also forced investigators to grapple with the human element. The terror experienced by the family, the grief of Romy, the shock of staff and neighbors. These emotional factors interact with physical evidence in ways that complicate narrative construction. Humans are unpredictable. Reactions are inconsistent. Memory is selective. And in high-stress situations, perception can be distorted, making reconstruction of events a challenge. It is here, at the intersection of forensic precision and psychological insight, that the investigation had to tread carefully. Every clue, every statement, every observation had to be weighed not just for what it revealed, but for what it might obscure. And the most haunting aspect of the crime scene? Its intimacy. This was a home, not a public space. The attack was personal, brutal, and unmistakably targeted. Multiple sharp force injuries speak to rage, frustration, or a calculated attempt to control or punish. This was a message, whether intended or incidental, a violent imprint of human emotion on a domestic canvas. As the day turned to night, the Reiner estate became a locus of scrutiny, grief, and speculation. Police worked through evidence, witnesses, and timelines. The media swarmed with breaking headlines. Social media erupted with theories, rumors, and speculation. And through it all, the human story remained at the core: a family shattered, a daughter traumatized, a son accused, and a missing figure whose prior removal raised more questions than answers. But even as investigators pieced together physical evidence, the broader story, the story of influence, manipulation, and the complex interplay of family dynamics, remained largely hidden.